Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Kal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
Welcome to International Law Behind the Headlines. This is co-host Kal Raustiala, and I'm really pleased to have with us today Gian Luca Burci, who is was the legal counsel at the World Health Organization, and now is a professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Is that right, Gian Luca? Are you still at the Graduate Institute?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. And really an expert on international law in the global health realm. And what I've invited him to talk about today is something that I think is on the minds of many listeners, which is the coronavirus outbreak. And what we'll discuss is the international legal framework surrounding epidemics and pandemics like this. So a topic I think of great interest to many people, and especially to many international lawyers. So Gian Luca, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Sure, my pleasure.
And yeah, I thought what we would start with is really just the basics. You had a lot of experience at WHO. You know this area well. And maybe you could just explain for us what is the international law that governs this area? What does it look like? What kind of restraints do countries have? With particular attention to the issue of travel bans. And I know there was a piece in The Lancet, I think you were part of that, criticizing certain governments, I guess, I think it's fair to say, for taking actions that are arguably inconsistent with international law. So give us a flavor of what the kind of restraints are on what states can do in this realm.
Sure. So the main legal instrument that's applicable to try to control the international spread of disease is the international health regulations. They are not terribly well known to many international lawyers, but actually quite innovative instrument. This was adopted by the World Health Assembly, WHO's plenary body, in 2005, entered into force in 2007, and is in force for all 194 WHO member states plus Liechtenstein and the Holy See. So really a very global, universal instrument. This is the last version, if you want, of a long string of sanitary regulation and sanitary treaties that goes back actually to the end of the 19th century. So the international cooperation to prevent epidemics and or control them if they take place is nothing new. But the current IHR are kind of innovative because they are very open-ended. They can apply to any event that leads to international spread of disease, even if it is an act of bioterrorism or a chemical spill in an international river and so on. As you can imagine, this wasn't an easy negotiation. There were many things at stake, including sovereignty, including trade, including biosecurity, and so on. So the IHR, as you call it, is a bit of a compromise solution that gives a lot of power to the WHO Secretariat. For example, you remember that WHO declared the current coronavirus as a public health emergency at the end of January. That's a power given to WHO by the IHR, and to make what we call temporary recommendations, which WHO did. For example, don't suspend travel and trade. But then states sometimes, actually quite often I must say, don't exactly follow what WHO preaches. So that's an open question. If we can follow up on how to qualify legally these measures that sort of diverge or go beyond the WHO recommendations.
I guess just a couple of technical issues so we understand the context here. The IHR, is it a treaty under international law? Yeah,
it's actually, I would say, a secondary source, like a Security Council resolution, but it's legally binding under the WHO Constitution. On that, there is no doubt. It's binding on as a treaty.
Okay, interesting. So it derives its legal effect and legal power from the larger WHO Constitution, which is a treaty under, let's say, Vienna Convention understandings of treaty. Okay, perfect. And so, so in terms of the process that you just mentioned within WHO, so it gives WHO, or this structure gives WHO a certain amount of power to declare a global emergency, and once that's declared, then what kicks in at that point? What does that enable states to take certain actions they couldn't previously take as a legal matter?
Well, first of all, the IHR, I think we need to clarify the scope, because sometimes there are over expectations with what it can do. It's largely an instrument of alert and to try to ensure like a coordinated response, precisely to avoid these irrational, excessive measures that sometimes do more harm than good. So when an emergency has been declared, some states have their own national system in place. For example, they have locked in contracts with pharmaceutical companies to try to have sort of a advanced purchase of vaccines and other medicine, but that's national issue. At an international level, under the IHR, the main consequence is the WHO issues these temporary recommendations, and states go beyond, do things that would otherwise breach a number of IHR provisions. There is an Article 43, which is a bit of an accountability mechanism. It allows states to do that, but they need to report the rationale for doing that, and they need to reconsider in good faith those measures if they are prompted by WHO, if these measures are clearly excessive, and so on. It was a compromise solution, very difficult, negotiated at the last moment, so it's quite imperfect. And WHO historically is a pretty differential organization to its member state. It's not into naming and shaming, antagonistic behavior. So there is also not much pressure on these states to reconsider the action. There's not much naming and shaming, and the political pressure, if it takes place, it's more at a bilateral level or sometimes through different institutions. For example, WTO, when these measures lead to embargoes or a restriction on trade.
Great. I do want to circle back on that issue in a little bit. So in terms of the coronavirus currently, would you characterize the reaction of most states, most WHO members, which effectively are virtually every state, as being generally consistent with the international legal framework, inconsistent, or how would you sort of assess the situation right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, this information is in a bit anecdotal, because there is no sort of published list, for example, by WHO on what states are doing. So we see it in the press, we see it in statements by this country, but we are missing a clear sort of list of who is doing what. So certain countries have left the boundaries pretty open, but they do, for example, screening of incoming passengers from India, or quarantine for certain groups, for example, they're coming back from China, and so on. Mm-hmm. Other countries have suspended travel. For example, the United States has more or less blocked travel from people coming from China, not just from Wuhan, but as I understand, the whole of China, most of China. So there's quite a variety of measures, and actually I wish there was more transparency. Would be easier to reach some conclusion on what is arguably lawful or not, on the level of compliance and the limit of lawful behavior under the IHR. But this is unfortunately kind of missing.
That's really interesting. Now, earlier you mentioned about some reporting requirements. So under the current system, WHO members are not required when an emergency is declared to essentially state their policy. So there's no kind of clearinghouse for that. Is that something that's been considered in the past?
No, you're right. There is no sort of the legal requirement to report on what they're doing. WHO requires the states to report every year on their implementation in general terms with the IHR, but it's fairly broad. Okay. And so they can choose to specify what they're doing in response to particular crisis or not. And WHO sort of compiles them and gives like a macro picture to the Health Assembly. It doesn't go into the specificity of what individual states are doing. So where the reporting requirement kicks in is if states do what I described before under Article 43, so clearly go beyond or diverge from WHO recommendation, do things that otherwise are in breach. So they have like a good faith obligation to report these measures, because they would otherwise possibly breach the IHR. Or the Secretariat can be proactive in reaching out because it finds out from the media and so on. But that's a very specific and narrow reporting requirement.
I see. So, I guess one other question that I realize I don't know how often this happens. When was the last time that there was such a global emergency declared? Or let's say, how often in the last decade or two? Is this something that's very rare?
Yeah, well, as I said, the IHR entered into force in 2007, so we are almost 13 years of implementation, and we have 6 emergencies.
Okay.
You may remember the H1N1 influenza in 2009, 2010. That was really the baptism of fire of the revised IHR. Then we had Ebola in 2014. Everybody remembers the global panic there. At the same time, the same year, poliomyelitis was declared an emergency. Many people sort of frowned because it's nothing new, but we were losing control over the attempt to eradicate the disease. So that was seen enough of a reason to declare it an emergency. And then we had Zika in Brazil. That didn't last very long. It lasted only a few months. We had the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is still an emergency, but it's being controlled apparently. And now we have the coronavirus. So 6 emergencies in about 13 years.
And when an emergency is declared, is there a sort of time limit, or does the WHO itself have to then essentially reverse it and say the emergency is over?
Well, yes, it has to declare that it's over. And so these temporary recommendations that I was mentioning had to be reviewed every 3 months. Every 3 months, there is an opportunity to bring back a committee of experts that advises the Director General on this, and that sort of follows the epidemiological situation, whether it should still remain an emergency or not. But it has to be explicitly terminated and reversed at some point.
Great. So as I think you said a moment ago, in the case of the Congo, there is still an ongoing emergency.
Yeah.
Did I hear right?
Yes. The open, let's say, pending emergency are still poliomyelitis, which is frankly an anomaly. And I think it was politically used to put pressure on Pakistan, which is the biggest endemic country and the reason for a possible failure of the eradication campaign. So it's polio, it's the Ebola, and now, of course, this COVID-19 coronavirus.
Let's turn to the issue of quarantine, because I think that's attracted a lot of media attention. People are obviously very interested in that and concerned about what it might mean. And so, I'm here in California. I know we've had a number of American planes come in to a local airbase, and the individuals coming from China have been quarantined. There's, of course, the cruise ship issue. So these, I assume from what you said so far, that these efforts at quarantine internally within a given state are to some degree governed by the IHR. But can you elaborate a little on that, and how much latitude do states have, and do you think those measures are appropriate?
The states, I think, have quite a lot of discretion in taking these measures. Because after all, quarantines are like historical measures to try to stop the disease at the border. So there are very sort of valid reasons to impose these measures. To a certain extent, they follow under the IHR, but the IHR sometimes, in terms of its scope of application, talks about travelers, and in other cases, it talks about persons. So there is a bit of an ambiguity there, where certain measures are relevant when they're applied to travelers, to people traveling internationally, or whether to protect anybody within the territory of a state. So there is a bit of an ambiguity there. But be as it may, in a way, states should, besides the IHR, obviously look at their own human rights obligations when they impose quarantines, because these are obviously limits to personal freedom, to freedom of movement, and so on. And so they should apply the sort of normal criteria to assess the legitimacy and proportionality and necessity of their actions to protect the community, to protect public health as a global value, as a community value, versus individual rights. And it's interesting that, at least in the media, the human rights element is largely, I haven't seen it mentioned very much.
No, I haven't either.
In particular, not for China, which is at this point is quarantining about 60 million people. So the population of Italy is being quarantined in China. And so that element, I think it is disappointing that it's kind of missing from the conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you raised that, because I have noticed a couple of stories that have pointed to, they've never used human rights language that I haven't searched, but I certainly have not seen that. But one or two stories have mentioned that people in Wuhan itself feel that they are essentially being sacrificed, that there's this containment effort, and at least whoever was interviewed by the particular reporter, had the sense of they're being sacrificed for the greater good, I guess, of the health of the Chinese population, something like that, which of course raises so many difficult human rights issues, and especially with something like this that seems quite contagious and yet is not actually so deadly. It's just a complicated set of questions. So I completely agree with you. That seems absent and important. Is that something that's discussed widely in the global health world, this kind of intersection or tension between human rights law on one hand and, let's say, global health concerns on the other?
It's not been discussed very much within WHO, and as far as I can see, and within the global health community in the sense of practice and policy, because it's a community in particular at the technical level that is not terribly familiar with human rights. Sometimes it's seen actually as a distraction, as a risk of politicizing good technical public health work. So the human rights argument is lacking a little bit. Scholars are looking at that. And there is work in progress, I think, also to look at the criteria to judge the legitimacy of what countries are doing, the legality under the IHR, and so on. But WHO, for example, has been sort of praising every single time the Director General makes a statement, have been praising China for what they're doing. Obviously, you can see also political intent to keep China engaged, not to antagonize them, and to recognize the incredible efforts they are putting into this. But then, it makes the human rights scrutiny a bit more difficult because the WHO, with this sort of epistemic authority, comes and say these are necessary measures, are all fine, absolutely. Then it sort of stacks the deck a bit in favor of China, maybe a bit too much. An important point is, so how these measures are administered. It's not like a one size fits all. If these quarantines can be seen as necessary, and during an emergency, sometimes you need to err on the side of caution. It's a no-regret policy like what WHO does. But are people being fed? Can they do the food shopping? Do they have water? Do they have access to basic services? So it's the modalities of how the restrictions take place that, to me, can make a big difference into assessing their consistency with human rights standards. It's not just are they quarantined or not, but how are they quarantined?
And in your judgment, is the Chinese quarantine now, from what you can tell, consistent with, let's say, best practices as they're understood in Geneva?
Hard to say, because you basically see what China is saying, and there is no real sort of independent verification. But it seems that the conditions, in particular in Wuhan, in the area which is under strictest control, are quite harsh. And as you said, there is a sense that yes, these people are being sacrificed to protect the community, and so be it. That's the eternal dilemma of public health versus human rights versus individual entitlements, and sometimes the interests of the community have to prevail. But what I've seen, many anecdotally from the media, is a pretty sort of harsh restrictions, and some people are saying that maybe excessively harsh. That there can be adjustment to make them more humane. Mm-hmm. So it's not easy to judge these things. I've been hearing a lot of opinions, in particular from technical colleagues in WHO, that say, be careful to be too harsh on China, because what you do in an emergency sometimes can be easily sort of second-guessed after the crisis is over. But during the crisis, you need to give a lot of sort of deference and discretion to countries to apply the measures that they think it's appropriate. And I was listening the other day to a webcast from the Munich Security Conference, and there was a town hall meeting on the coronavirus outbreak, and one of the speakers was a deputy foreign minister of China. And he made it very clear that he expects the world to recognize what China is doing, not only for its own benefit, but for the benefit of the world. They clearly said, if you have a handful of cases outside China, it's largely because of what China is doing in containing the virus. So also this aspect has to be taken into account and I think respected.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So just to clarify, if it turned out that coronavirus, or COVID-19 as it's called now, is even more infectious and more deadly than we realized, maybe more like an Ebola or something, and if China, or any country for that matter, essentially sealed up an entire city or province and essentially sacrificed those people within that border to contain it, there's nothing in the WHO rules or other rules that would bar that? Am I right? Is that is actually a permissible practice?
Yeah, I think the sort of WHO rules are agnostic about that. There's no sort of statutory system to assess measures like what China is taking within its territory. If people look at that, it's from a public health effectiveness. Is it containing the outbreak or not? It doesn't seem to be containing the outbreak because the figures skyrocket one day after the other. And the epicenter of the outbreak continues to be Wuhan and the Hubei province. So these measures evidently are not slowing down the spread of virus within that particular area. So something is going wrong there. Similar as this ship in the port of Yokohama. How can you keep more than 3,000 people confined to the cabins and having figures of infected passengers increase every day? So measures were not appropriate. I think that there was some screw up there. So you need also to consider that aspect.
Sure. Let's turn to trade. You mentioned that a moment ago. So obviously the movement of persons is maybe the most salient, most concerning issue. But clearly this emergency, largely because of China's incredibly significant economic role, but I can imagine any sort of epidemic or pandemic having economic implications, as they often do locally, but then also in terms of trade. And I know here, even in Los Angeles, the port is apparently, we're the largest entry point for goods from China, and there's a significant slowdown for a whole host of reasons. So what is the connection between the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization in this regard? And are states, I guess, able to take whatever trade measures they want, subject to WTO rules, or are those rules trumped somehow in a global emergency by WHO rules? So I guess, in essence, how do these two bodies of law interact, and who ends up on top?
Yeah, good question. And this was one of the, I think, biggest points during the negotiation, what kept negotiators until 4 a.m. There's no sort of clearly institutionalized link between the two regimes. But it's fair to say that the IHR were drafted with WTO very much in mind to avoid situation of incompatibility where states would have to choose between the IHR and the WTO agreements because there was a clear conflict. So there is a requirement of a risk assessment of basing actions on science under the IHR as much as there are under the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, or the agreement on GATT for that matter. So there has clearly been an effort on the part of the negotiators of the IHR to ensure consistency. It's interesting because I don't think trade restrictions are an issue for coronavirus because the no sort of commodities that are incriminated as vector of the virus. It was the case for a bit during the H1N1 influenza because of this, at the beginning, this association with pigs and pork meat. And I believe China, for example, and other countries blocked the import of Canadian and American pork. And there was immediately a reaction by these countries in the SPS committee, a committee administering the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, that there was no scientific basis and that the IHR did not justify those measures. So I think that actually sometimes the actions and reactions ensure rationality and proportionality in health measures. So one thing does not trump the other. They're very much sort of applicable in parallel, but with an effort in consistency, that's very sure.
The WTO and WHO rules and regulations on, let's say, SPS and the IHR are really fairly compatible and both take a fairly scientific approach.
Yeah, that was clearly the intention. Then it's obvious that sometimes states take excessive measures, or maybe they use an outbreak as a pretext for protectionist measures. Then when the disciplines in the WTO agreements, I think, are very useful, also as a corrective to actions taken supposedly under the frame of the IHR.
Just thinking about the Chinese dimension of this, I know that Taiwan is not a WHO member, and I'm assuming Taiwan is the largest country that isn't. Am I right? Or there are many other countries of comparable size that are not WHO members? Well,
as you know, for the United Nations system, sorry to give you the party line, but Taiwan is not a country, it's a province of China.
Yes, I know that is the party line. All of that said, having visited Taiwan, that's not a common view in Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan's a very big place and it's very close to China. So I'm just curious, this must be a complicated issue within WHO. And just as a practical matter, when you have a place of that size outside of the system, it does seem to pose some challenges. So I'm just curious, how does that work? So if it turned out that Taiwan was the locus of a variant of coronavirus, or Taiwan became a particular vector in some way, how does the WHO system deal with that?
Yeah, as you said, it's a very complicated system, and I was at the forefront of those complications as former legal counsel of WHO. Because WHO, precisely because of what you're saying, has kept the door ajar for Taiwan, unless other international organizations where the door is firmly shut. So, for example, we have an arrangement. There was sort of an informal arrangement with China that would allow WHO to communicate directly with Taiwan under the IHR, but as obviously subject to some form of approval by the Chinese government, which is very strict in enforcing the one China policies you can imagine. So there are channels, there are tools to communicate with the Taiwanese health authority in case of need, but we have to respect certain protocols because, frankly, the Secretariat has basically no discretion in this matter. China, I heard a statement made by the Chinese delegation in the executive board of WHO a couple of weeks ago, makes it very clear they're in constant touch with Taipei, with Taiwan, and so the constant communication, and so there is no sense. It's a politicization when Taiwan says we are left out of the picture. We can become a global risk, and we are the receiving end of global risks. China takes pains to deny that and to say that there is constant communication, as there are communication with Taiwan that can safely go through China. But be as it may, there are also channels that have been agreed with the Chinese to talk directly to Taiwan.
Great. I guess final question, this has been a really terrific discussion, and I'm just curious, you mentioned a few times that in the negotiations of the international health regulations, obviously many compromises were made, a complicated set of issues that really touch on core sovereignty interests, including the movement of persons, which has always been something that states have enormous discretion over. So I'm just curious if you could reflect a little bit on what you think is missing from the IHR. So if there were a review conference next year and member states were reconsidering those regulations, what would you like to see that isn't there now?
I have pretty strong views on this, but I seem to be in a minority. And so it's clear that the IHR have several flaws. And it's not surprising because it was very difficult to revise them from the old version. And basically the text was approved in a year and a half because of the momentum created by the SARS outbreak. So if they are not perfect, it is no surprise. I think what should be changed is first, this idea of the emergency. I think the concept of emergency has not served the world well. It's too fraught, it's too loaded. It makes it difficult to think of alternative mechanism because now it's either an emergency or nothing. And reality is more complex. So to go beyond this concept of emergency and to have a more nuanced graduate system of alert. The second, it needs to incorporate a system of compliance assessment. There is no sort of institutionalized system to assess compliance as part of the IHR. There will be sort of voluntary workarounds, but that to me is not the same as having something under the framework of the IHR. And third, to have more clarity on these travel bans or these additional measures. And now it's really ambiguous, and to have a clearer system to assess compliance and non-compliance. Otherwise, I think we risk to having a marginalization of the IHR and more reliance on the typical sort of normative processes of WHO that don't necessarily rely on the IHR. I think there is also a question of financing, because the WHO has to play its role. It needs money, and it needs flexible money, not earmarked by donors and so on. And that's something that the IHR was not necessarily supposed to generate, but certainly has not been generating. So also this aspect, I think is essential if we want to keep the credibility of the system.
Wow, that's a fantastic set of suggestions. So first of all, thank you so much, Gian Luca, for coming on and clarifying so many of these things that I know I personally was was quite confused or ignorant about, and I imagine a lot of listeners were as well. You really did a terrific job. So I hope to have you on the podcast again, not around coronavirus. I hope it comes to a quick end, but I'm sure that health issues will emerge on the international landscape in the future, and we'd love to have you back.
With pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.